"The table's full," my daughter-in-law said, not even looking at me. "You can eat in the kitchen." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, like something misplaced, but no one willing to pick it up. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. After all, this was my home. The same dining room I had spent 32 years setting for birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday dinners. The same oak table my late husband, Richard, had insisted on buying even when we could barely afford it, saying one day it would hold our whole family. And now it did. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I stood at the end of the table, my hands still wrapped around the serving dish I had just brought out from the kitchen, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary clinging faintly to my sweater. No one spoke. Not Emily. Not my son Daniel. Not even my granddaughter, Sophie, who usually greeted me first with a hug. The silence wasn't loud. It was careful. Chosen. I felt it settle into the room like dust. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, glancing at his plate instead of at me. Emily adjusted her napkin with neat, deliberate movements, as if she had just made a perfectly reasonable suggestion about the weather. "There's just not enough space tonight," she added, her tone light, almost pleasant, as though that made it better. I looked at the table then. 8 chairs, 8 people, and 1 empty seat, at the far end, where Richard used to sit. My seat. I had always sat beside him. For years, no one else ever took that place. But tonight, someone had moved things around. Subtly, quietly, efficiently, just enough so there was no longer room for me. I nodded before anyone could say anything else. Not because I agreed, but because I understood. I set the dish down gently in the center of the table, careful not to let it clatter. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. "Of course," I said, my voice even, almost polite. No one stopped me. Not a single voice said, "Mom, wait." Not a single chair shifted to make space. I picked up a plate from the stack, served myself a small portion, and turned toward the kitchen. Each step felt strangely measured, as if I were walking through a house that no longer recognized me. Behind me, the soft murmur of conversation resumed, cautious at first, then gradually returning to something like normal. A faint laugh, the clink of silverware. Life continuing, just without me in it. I reached the kitchen and set my plate down on the counter for a second before pulling out a chair. It was the same chair I used every morning for coffee, the one with the slightly uneven leg Richard had always promised to fix. I sat down slowly, listening. From here, I could still hear everything. The stories, the laughter, Emily's voice weaving easily through it all, confident and warm, as if she belonged at the center of it, as if she always had. I looked down at my plate, then back toward the doorway that led to the dining room. The light from the chandelier spilled just far enough to cast a soft glow across the kitchen floor, stopping a few inches short of my feet. I noticed then something small, something I might have missed on any other night. The cabinet doors had been rearranged. The dishes I had used for years were no longer where I kept them. My things were still here, just moved, adjusted, quietly pushed aside. I let out a slow breath and picked up my fork. The food tasted the same, but nothing else did. And for the first time, sitting alone in my own kitchen, I realized this wasn't about a chair at the table. It was about something much bigger, something that had been happening right in front of me, one small change at a time, until there was no place left for me at all. I did not finish my dinner. I sat there for a while, long enough for the food to cool, long enough for the voices in the dining room to grow louder, more relaxed, as if whatever hesitation had been there before had completely dissolved. I could hear Emily telling a story now, something about a dinner party she had attended the week before, her voice animated, confident, filling the space in a way that felt practiced. Daniel laughed at the right moments. Not forced, not uncomfortable, just natural. That was the part that stayed with me. It sounded natural. I pushed my plate away after a few bites and stood up, rinsing it under warm water out of habit more than necessity. The sink light cast a soft yellow glow across the counter, and for a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. The same faucet, the same small scratch near the edge where a pan had slipped once, the same window above the sink, reflecting back a version of the kitchen that felt untouched. But it was not the same. I dried my hands slowly and glanced toward the doorway again. From this angle, I could see just enough of the dining room to notice something else. Emily had placed a new centerpiece on the table, white flowers in a tall glass vase. I had not bought those. I would have noticed. I always notice things like that. The old centerpiece, the one Richard and I picked out together years ago, a simple wooden tray with small candles, was gone. Not broken. Not replaced openly. Just gone. I turned back to the counter and opened one of the cabinets without thinking. Plates. Bowls. But arranged differently. My favorite set, the blue-edged china I used for special occasions, had been moved to the back, partially hidden behind newer pieces I did not recognize. I closed the cabinet slowly, then opened another. The same thing. Everything still there. Just not where it belonged. A quiet reordering. A subtle rewriting of the space. I leaned my hand against the counter and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It was not sudden. That was the realization that settled in, slow and certain. This had not happened overnight. It had been building. Small adjustments. Minor changes. Things I had dismissed. A chair moved slightly out of place. A drawer that felt unfamiliar. Conversations that did not include me anymore, even when I was in the room. I thought back to last month, when Emily suggested reorganizing the pantry to make things easier. I had agreed. It seemed harmless. Helpful even. But after that, I had found myself searching for things in my own kitchen, opening the wrong doors, hesitating for a second longer than I used to. And then there was the living room. The photographs. I had noticed that too, though I told myself it was nothing. The framed picture of Richard and me from our 30th anniversary dinner had been moved from the mantel to a side shelf. In its place was a newer photo. Emily and Daniel on a beach, smiling into the sun. I had said nothing. I always said nothing. I walked over to the small table near the window and rested my hand on the back of the chair. From here, the laughter sounded clearer. Warmer. Like something I used to be part of. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of sadness, but to steady the thought forming in my mind. This was not about a single moment at dinner. It was not about one sentence spoken too casually. It was a pattern. A careful, consistent pattern of being moved, shifted, and quietly erased. And the most unsettling part was not that it was happening. It was that I had allowed myself to believe it was not. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep had stopped offering any comfort. The house was quiet in that particular way it only is before everyone else wakes, when the air feels still and untouched, like it is waiting for something to begin. I moved through the kitchen slowly, almost carefully, as if I were a guest trying not to disturb anyone. The coffee maker was already set differently than I remembered. The buttons had been reprogrammed. The mug I usually used was no longer on the front hook, replaced by a newer set that matched the dishes I had noticed the night before. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering slightly before choosing one of the unfamiliar mugs. It felt strange in my grip, lighter than the one I had used for years. I poured the coffee and sat down at the small table by the window, the same chair, the same uneven leg, the same quiet creak as I shifted my weight. Outside, the early morning light stretched across the yard Richard had once cared for so meticulously, every inch of it shaped by his hands. I used to know every detail out there. Now, I realized I had not paid attention in weeks. Maybe longer. Footsteps sounded softly from upstairs, followed by the low hum of voices. Emily and Daniel. Their tones were casual, unhurried, as if nothing had changed, as if nothing needed to be explained. I kept my eyes on my cup, listening without meaning to. "We should move forward with it," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "It is just practical at this point." There was a pause. I could picture Daniel nodding, the way he always did when he wanted to avoid a longer conversation. "I know," he replied quietly. "I just do not want it to feel sudden." "It will not," Emily said quickly. "We have been easing into it for months." Months. The words settled heavily in my chest. Not sharp, not painful, just confirming. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth ground me. Easing into it. That was exactly what it felt like. Not a single moment of rejection, but a gradual shift, carefully managed, so that by the time I noticed, the decision had already been made. I heard them start down the stairs, their footsteps growing louder, and I straightened slightly in my chair, placing the mug back onto the table with quiet precision. When they entered the kitchen, Emily offered me a polite smile, the kind you give to someone you respect just enough to maintain appearances. "Good morning," she said lightly, moving past me to the counter. Daniel followed behind her, his eyes flickering toward me for a brief second before settling somewhere else. "Morning, Mom." I nodded once. "Good morning." No one mentioned the night before. Not the table. Not the kitchen. Not the space that had been taken without a word. Emily opened the refrigerator and began taking things out, moving with a confidence that came from familiarity. Her kitchen now. That was how she moved. Not like someone borrowing space, but like someone who had already claimed it. I watched her for a moment, then looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They were still steady. That surprised me more than anything. "We are thinking of making a few changes around the house," Emily said casually, as if continuing a conversation that had never included me. "Just small updates. To make things more functional." I did not respond right away. I did not ask what kind of changes. I did not need to. I already knew what she meant. Functional did not mean better. It meant different. It meant adjusted to fit a version of this house that no longer included me in the same way. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, as if he wanted to add something, but did not. The silence stretched. For a moment, thin but unbroken. I lifted my gaze and met Emily's eyes briefly. She held my look for just a second longer than necessary, then smiled again, softer this time, almost reassuring, as if this was all being done for the best. I nodded once, slowly, and picked up my coffee again. The house was still mine. Every wall, every room, every memory built into its foundation. But sitting there, in that quiet kitchen, listening to plans being made without me, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They were not asking me to leave. Not yet. They were simply preparing for the day when I would no longer belong. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house more slowly than usual, not because I was tired, but because I was noticing things I had not allowed myself to notice before. It started in the living room. The curtains had been changed. Not dramatically, just a lighter fabric, a softer color, something that let in more light, but somehow made the room feel less grounded. I stood there for a moment, running my fingers along the edge of the fabric, trying to remember when it had happened. I could not. That was what unsettled me. Changes had been made without a single clear moment to point to. No conversation. No decision I had agreed to. Just a quiet transition from what was mine to what was becoming something else. I turned toward the mantel, my eyes instinctively going to the place where Richard's photograph used to sit. It was still there, but not where it had been. It had been moved to the side, angled slightly, as if it were part of a collection rather than the center of it. In the middle now was a new arrangement. Framed photos of Emily and Daniel, one of Sophie from her last school recital, another from a vacation I had not been invited to. I stepped closer, studying the arrangement, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity. This was not carelessness. It was intentional. Subtle, but intentional. I reached out and adjusted Richard's frame, just slightly, straightening it so it faced forward again. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It reminded me that there had been a time when this house reflected a life that I had built, not one that was being rewritten around me. As I moved through the hallway, I paused outside the guest room. The door was open, and inside, the bed had been replaced. New bedding, new furniture, even the old dresser I had kept for years was gone. In its place was something modern, minimal, and personal. I stepped inside slowly, my footsteps soft against the carpet. This had been the room where my sister stayed during the holidays, where friends had slept after long evenings filled with conversation and laughter. It had history, memory. Now it felt like a showroom. I turned back toward the door and continued down the hall until I reached my bedroom. For a moment, I hesitated before stepping inside, as if I needed to prepare myself for what I might find. But when I entered, everything looked the same. The bed, the nightstands, the lamp Richard had bought me years ago when I complained about reading in dim light. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been changed. I stood there quietly, taking it in, and then I understood. This room had been left untouched not out of respect, but because it had not been dealt with yet. It was the last space. The final piece. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting lightly on the comforter, and looked around slowly. Every object in this room held a memory, not just of Richard, but of the life we had built together. The decisions we made. The years we spent turning this house into something that felt permanent. I had believed that permanence meant security. That once something was built with enough care, it could not be quietly taken apart. But I saw now how wrong that was. It did not take force. It did not take confrontation. It only took time, and patience, and someone willing to make small changes that no one questioned until the original shape of things had disappeared completely. I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze settle on the ceiling, and for the first time since the night before, I allowed myself to think beyond what was happening to why it was happening. Emily was not simply rearranging furniture. She was redefining ownership, not through words, not through arguments, but through presence, through control of space, through decisions made without asking. And Daniel, he was allowing it. That realization did not come with anger. It came with something colder, something quieter, a recognition that whatever role I had once held in this house had already been replaced in ways that could not be undone by simply speaking up. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the room wrapping around me, not heavy, not suffocating, but clear. And in that clarity, a thought settled in, steady and unshaken. If everything could be changed this easily, then nothing I assumed was secure truly was. Not the house, not my place in it, not even the story I had been telling myself about what this family still was. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway again, not because I had anywhere to go, but because I had started to understand that standing still was no longer the same as belonging. The house no longer moved around me. It moved without me. I turned toward the staircase when I heard light footsteps coming down, softer than the steady rhythm of adults. Sophie appeared at the bottom, her backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, her hair slightly out of place from the school day. She stopped when she saw me, her expression shifting from neutral to something more careful, as if she was deciding how to approach me. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, offering a small smile. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and set her backpack down by the wall, glancing briefly toward the living room where voices carried faintly from a television Emily had turned on earlier. Sophie leaned closer to me, lowering her voice slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question was simple, but it landed with more weight than anything else that had been said in this house all day. I studied her face for a moment, the sincerity in her eyes, the uncertainty. She had noticed. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. "Why do you ask?" I said gently. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Mom said you like being in the kitchen more, but you never used to sit there." I held her gaze for a second longer, then looked away, not to avoid her, but to steady the response forming in my mind. Children did not invent things like that. They repeated what they were told, carefully, casually, as if it were normal. "Sometimes things change," I said quietly. Sophie frowned slightly, not convinced. "It does not seem like a good change," she murmured. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was honest. I reached out and gently smoothed a strand of hair away from her face. "You pay attention," I said. She nodded once, then glanced again toward the living room, lowering her voice even further. "Mom said we might have to make more room soon. She said it is better if everything is organized." The word lingered for a moment, familiar now, carrying more meaning than it appeared to on the surface. Organized, functional, easier, all words that sounded harmless, all words that moved things out of place. "Did she say what that means?" I asked. Sophie shook her head. "Just that some things might be moved. Or people." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching my face as if trying to understand something she could not quite name. "Are you going somewhere?" The question was soft, almost hesitant, but it cut through the quiet of the hallway with absolute clarity. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked past her, toward the living room, where the television continued to play and Emily's voice occasionally rose above it, light and unbothered. Plans were being made. Not loudly, not directly, but consistently. I brought my attention back to Sophie and placed my hand lightly on her shoulder. "Not yet," I said, my voice calm, steady. She seemed to relax slightly at that, though the uncertainty did not leave her expression entirely. "Okay," she said, nodding once, as if accepting an answer she was not completely satisfied with. She picked up her backpack and headed toward the stairs, pausing halfway up to glance back at me before continuing. I remained where I was long after she disappeared from view, the quiet of the house settling around me once again. It was different now, not empty, not silent, but layered. Conversations beneath conversations, decisions beneath words, and somewhere within all of it, a truth that was no longer subtle. This was not just about being moved aside. It was about being replaced. Not suddenly, not harshly, but carefully enough that no one would feel the need to question it. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned slowly toward the kitchen, the same path I had taken the night before. But this time, I was not confused. I was not uncertain. I understood exactly what was happening. And more importantly, I understood that they believed I did not. I did not say anything more that evening. I did not question Emily. I did not ask Daniel what he meant that morning. I simply moved through the rest of the day the way I always had, preparing dinner, setting plates, folding napkins, placing everything exactly where it belonged. Or at least, where it used to belong. This time, when it was ready, I did not carry the dishes to the dining room right away. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the counter, listening. The television was on again. Emily's voice drifted in and out of the background, calm, controlled, filling the space in a way that suggested she was entirely comfortable with the way things were. Daniel responded occasionally, his tone neutral, agreeable. Nothing in their voices suggested hesitation. Nothing suggested they felt they were doing anything wrong. That was what made it so precise, so deliberate. I picked up one of the plates and walked toward the dining room, slower this time, not because I was uncertain, but because I was observing, measuring. The table had already been set, not by me. The new plates, the new arrangement, the white flowers still standing tall in the center as if they had always been there. There were enough seats. There had always been enough seats. I placed the plate down carefully, aligning it with the others, and stepped back slightly. Emily glanced up briefly. "Oh, you do not have to worry about setting the table anymore," she said lightly. "I have it handled." I nodded once. "I see that." My voice was calm, even. There was no reason for it not to be. Daniel did not look up this time. He focused on adjusting his chair, pulling it slightly closer to the table, his movements small but intentional. I watched him for a second, then turned back toward the kitchen without another word. When dinner began, I did not wait to be told where to sit. I did not walk toward the table at all. Instead, I remained in the kitchen, preparing my plate the same way I had the night before. But this time there was no hesitation, no pause. I carried it to the same chair by the window and sat down, listening as their conversation unfolded without interruption. It was easier this way, cleaner. That was what they wanted. A quiet transition. No confrontation. No scene. Just a gradual shift until everything felt natural. I took a bite, chewing slowly, thoughtfully, my attention not on the food but on the rhythm of their voices. Emily spoke about upcoming plans, about making better use of the space, about how the house needed to evolve to fit their needs now. Their needs, not ours, not mine. Daniel agreed, offering small affirmations, never questioning, never challenging. The pattern was complete. I set my fork down for a moment and looked out the window, the last light of the day fading across the yard. Richard had once told me that people reveal their intentions not in what they say, but in what they assume you will accept. I understood that now. They assumed I would accept this. The separation, the quiet removal, the idea that my place could be reduced without resistance. I picked up my fork again and finished my meal without rushing. When I was done, I washed my plate, dried it, and placed it back into the cabinet, not in the front, not in the place it once held, but in the back where it had been moved. Exactly where they expected it to be. For now, because for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer reacting. I was watching. And more importantly, I was beginning to understand that if they believed this change was complete, then they had already made their first mistake. The next few days followed the same pattern, but now that I was paying attention, the details became impossible to ignore. It was not just the kitchen. It was not just the table. It was the way decisions were made before I even knew there was something to decide. On Wednesday morning, I found a stack of papers neatly placed on the corner of the dining room table. They were not hidden. Not exactly. Just positioned in a way that suggested they did not belong to me. I walked over slowly, my footsteps quiet against the floor, and glanced down without touching them. Floor plans. Measurements. Notes written in Emily's handwriting. Words like convert, expand, and optimize circled in careful loops. I recognized the layout immediately. This house. My house. Or at least, the version of it they were planning to reshape. I did not pick the papers up. I did not need to. I already understood what they meant. Behind me, I heard Emily's voice before I saw her. "Oh, I was going to go over those with Daniel later," she said casually, as if I had simply wandered into a conversation that was not meant for me. I turned slightly to face her. Plans? I asked, my tone neutral. She smiled, the same controlled, reassuring smile she always used. Just ideas. Nothing finalized. Nothing finalized. But already drawn. Already discussed. Already moving forward. Daniel appeared a moment later, his eyes flicking briefly between us. We just want to make better use of the space, he added, his voice measured, careful. Make things more efficient. I nodded once. Of course. Efficiency. Another word that sounded harmless. Another word that made room for change without asking permission. I stepped away from the table, leaving the papers exactly where they were, untouched. That was important. Not touching them. Not claiming them. Not reacting. Because I could feel it now, clearly. This was not just about what they were planning. It was about what they believed. They believed I would stay quiet. That I would adjust. That I would slowly accept each change as it came until there was nothing left to question. That I would not look too closely. That I would not understand. I moved into the living room and sat down, folding my hands in my lap, letting the silence settle around me again. From here, I could still hear them speaking in the dining room. Their voices lower now, more focused. Planning. Deciding. And for the first time, I did not feel pushed aside by it. I felt separate from it. That was different. That was new. Later that afternoon, I made my way to the study, a room that had remained mostly untouched, perhaps because it held less interest for Emily. The desk was still where Richard had left it. The drawers still held the same folders, the same neatly organized papers, the same careful system he had trusted me to understand. I opened the top drawer slowly and pulled out a familiar file, one I had not looked at in months. Property records. Documents with our names on them. Not just his. Not just mine. Ours. I sat down in the chair and began to read. Not quickly, not searching for anything specific, but reviewing, piece by piece, line by line. Details I had once known by heart. Signatures. Dates. Agreements that had been made long before Emily ever stepped into this house. Long before Daniel had begun to look at it as something that could be changed without consequence. I closed the file after a few minutes, placing it carefully back into the drawer exactly as I had found it. Nothing disturbed. Nothing out of place. I stood up and looked around the room one more time before turning toward the door. They were making plans. Quietly. Confidently. Believing they were in control. And I was letting them. Because sometimes the most important thing is not stopping a plan. It is understanding it completely before you decide what to do next. And now, finally, I was beginning to see the full picture. I waited until Friday to say anything, not because I needed more time, but because I wanted everything to unfold exactly as they expected. That evening, I set the table myself. Not the way Emily had been doing it, but the way I had always done it. The original plates. The wooden centerpiece I had taken from the back cabinet earlier that day. The candles, carefully placed, evenly spaced, just as Richard liked them. I did not rush. I did not make noise. I simply restored the table to what it had been, piece by piece. When Emily walked in, she stopped for a moment, her eyes moving across the table, taking in the changes. She did not comment right away. That was her pattern. Observe first. React later. Oh, she said finally, her tone light, but edged with something else, something tighter. I thought we agreed on a different setup. I met her gaze briefly, then returned to adjusting a fork so it aligned perfectly with the plate. We never discussed it, I replied calmly. Daniel entered a moment later, his attention shifting between the two of us, sensing something had changed, though he could not yet name it. What is going on? He asked. Emily let out a small breath, a controlled exhale. Your mother prefers the old arrangement, she said, as if explaining something minor, something temporary. I straightened slowly, placing my hands lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table. This is how the table has always been set, I said. Not defensively, not emotionally, just as a statement of fact. There was a pause. A brief one, but enough. Daniel looked at the table again, then at me, then back at Emily. For the first time, there was hesitation in his expression. Not disagreement. Not yet. But something close to uncertainty. Emily noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, just slightly, as she recalibrated. Well, she said smoothly, we are trying to make things more functional now. More current. There it was again. Functional. Current. Words that erased what came before without ever acknowledging it. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Not quickly. Not forcefully. Just deliberately. The movement itself was quiet, but its meaning was not. Emily's eyes flickered, just for a second, toward Daniel. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, caught between what had been and what he had allowed to change. I reached for my napkin and placed it neatly in my lap. "Dinner is ready," I said. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sophie stepped into the room, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at the table, then at me, then at her parents. She walked over and took her usual seat without hesitation. That was enough. Daniel followed, slower this time, pulling out his chair and sitting down across from me. Emily remained standing for a second longer, her gaze steady, calculating, as if deciding whether to push further or let the moment pass. Then, with a small, controlled smile, she took her seat as well. The dinner that followed was quieter than usual. Not tense, not openly strained, but measured. Every word placed carefully, every movement observed. And for the first time since this had begun, I was not the one being adjusted. I was the one setting the pace. I did not need to argue. I did not need to explain. Because this was never about one dinner. It was about presence, about position, about who belonged at the center of this table. And as I sat there, under the soft light of the chandelier that had hung above us for decades, I understood something with complete certainty. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. And that was exactly why this moment mattered. The shift did not happen all at once, and that was what made it undeniable. It revealed itself in small hesitations, in pauses that had not existed before, in the way Daniel looked at me now, not with certainty, but with something closer to doubt. The morning after that dinner, I found him standing in the dining room alone, his hand resting on the back of one of the chairs as if he had forgotten why he walked in there. He glanced up when he saw me, his expression briefly unreadable. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Good morning," I replied, stepping into the room without hesitation, without waiting for permission that had never truly been his to give. The table was still set the way I had arranged it the night before. The wooden centerpiece remained in place. The candles had not been moved. That alone told me something had shifted. Emily would have changed it back immediately if she still believed she could do so without resistance. Daniel looked at the table, then back at me. "You did all this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," I said simply. He nodded once, slowly, as if processing something that did not fit as easily into his understanding as it once had. "It looks nice," he added after a moment. Nice. The word was small, but it carried more weight than he intended. It was not about whether it looked nice. It was about recognizing what had been there all along. Emily entered a few minutes later, her steps measured, her posture composed, but her eyes sharper now, more alert. She glanced at the table, then at Daniel, then at me. "We should talk about the layout again," she said, her tone controlled, but no longer casual. Daniel did not respond immediately. That was new. He looked at the table again, then pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for her lead. "Maybe we should slow down," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they landed with precision. Emily's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A calculation interrupted. A plan. Momentarily paused. I did not speak. I did not need to. The conversation was no longer happening around me. It was happening because of me. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, not to remove myself, but because I had already taken my place. The rest of the day unfolded without confrontation. No raised voices. No arguments. Just a subtle recalibration of space and behavior. Emily still moved through the house with purpose, but now there was a fraction of hesitation in her steps, a moment where she seemed to consider before acting. Daniel spoke less, but when he did, he watched more closely. And Sophie, she smiled at me that afternoon in a way she had not in days, open and certain, as if something she had been quietly worried about had shifted back into place. That evening, when dinner came, I did not wait in the kitchen. I walked to the table and took my seat without pause. No one stopped me. No one redirected me. Emily sat down across from me, her expression composed, but her eyes no longer dismissive. Daniel sat between us, his posture straighter, his attention present. The table was full, not because there was no room, but because everyone who belonged there was sitting where they should be. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap and looked at the familiar arrangement before me, the one that had never truly been lost, only tested. "Pass the potatoes, please," I said calmly. Daniel reached for the dish without hesitation and handed it to me. No one spoke about what had changed. They did not need to, because some things, once made clear, do not require explanation. They simply remain. And as I sat there, steady and certain, I understood something with complete clarity. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had not forced anything. I had simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, I reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. This house was not something to be rearranged around me. It was something that had been built with me at its center. And that was not a place anyone else could quietly take.